Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of Venezuela Crisis, Change, and Consequences, a spring 2026 series that's hosted by Columbia University's Institute of Latin American Studies. My name is Eduardo Moncada. I'm an associate professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia and director of the ILAS. Our first panel in this series examined the historical roots and current stakes of the US-Venezuela relationship. Our second panel took up the human costs of the crisis, mass displacement of Venezuelans, and the policy and humanitarian responses across the Americas. Today, in our third panel, we take up what is, in many ways, the kind of coercive infrastructure that underlies much of that crisis when we talk about violence, policing, and the role of armed actors inside Venezuela and across its borders. This panel brings together leading scholars and practitioners whose work spans ethnographic fieldwork on policing and everyday violence, sociological research on armed actors and marginalized territories, field-based analysis of transnational criminal networks, and systematic conflict event data from across the hemisphere. Together, I think and I'm sure that they will give us one of the most analytically rigorous accounts available today of Venezuela's security landscape, both what it's produced and what it means going forward as well. I'm going to hand things over to our moderator, Professor Jennifer Trowbridge. She is Term Assistant Professor of Human Rights at Barnard College, and she's going to introduce our speakers and lead today's discussion. So, Jennifer, the floor is yours. Jennifer, we may be having trouble hearing you. Well, in the meantime, as they fix some technical difficulties, why don't I go ahead and do some brief intros of our speakers today on the panel, so then we can just jump right into things. So I'll start with what I have here on my sheets. I'm going to start with Rebecca Hansen, who is associate professor at the University of Florida, where she's affiliated with the Department of Sociology, Criminology, and Law and the Center for Latin American Studies. She's the author of Policing the Revolution, published by Oxford University Press in 2025, which is the first systematic analysis of how Chavista security policies transformed Venezuelan policing and fueled the proliferation of armed actors. This is a project, a remarkable one, grounded in a decade of ethnographic and survey research, including participant observation and street-level police officers. Professor Veronica Zubillaga, who's in the room there, is a Venezuelan sociologist, Mellon visiting scholar in Latin American and Latino studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She's the co-editor of The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, published by University of Pittsburgh Press in 2022. And her work examines how armed violence reshapes everyday life in marginalized territories, particularly but not exclusively for women and families that are navigating overlapping armed actors in conditions of deepening crisis in Venezuela. Elizabeth Dickinson is Deputy Program Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the International Crisis Group, where she has led field-based research on armed conflict dynamics, organized crime, and the Colombia-Venezuela border for over 6 years. She reported from the border region in the immediate aftermath of the January 2026 operation and brings on the ground analytical depth to questions about how criminal networks are adapting to the current moment as well. And Tiziano Breda is a senior analyst for Latin America and the Caribbean at the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, the most widely used source of disaggregated conflict event data globally. He has been one of the most prominent analytical voices on Venezuela's security situation since that January 2026 intervention, and has been providing real-time analysis to major international media outlets. I'll now try to hand things over to Jennifer to moderate the conversation. Well, technical difficulties persist, it seems. Let's give it one more second and then see Well, I'm gonna get us going then. So why don't I get us started while they try to fix these technical difficulties? And perhaps if we could start with Becca Hansen, if you could give us a bit of some insights from your research on what's been happening on the ground, sort of what led to this kind of fragmentation of armed actors in Venezuela, so that we can kind of better understand the landscape at the moment.
There we go. Yeah, thanks so much, Eduardo. And thank you for the Institute of Latin American Studies, for the invitation, and Romina Casala for the coordination and logistical support. So yeah, to understand how Chavista governments transformed policing and coercive power and the implications this has for, I think, any political transition, which is some of the questions that were posed to me. We have to understand Venezuela as a case of a revolutionary project that catalyzed very intense long-term internecine conflict, state fragmentation, and what I've oftentimes referred to as the dispersal of coercive power. And I think looking at policing and the state security apparatus makes all of this crystal clear, right? Because rather than consolidating coercive power, what the Bolivarian Revolution did was produce a very fragmented and dispersed security landscape in which the state increasingly relied on multiple armed actors, some inside and some outside of formal institutions. So the result was not this like classic story of an authoritarian consolidation of coercion, but an ongoing reorganization of who exercised violence and how, right? And so all of these changes really rearranged coercive power within the state by implementing very contradictory and inconsistent security policies and creating a lot of new security institutions added on top of a ton of security institutions that already existed on the ground, right? And so rather than producing coordination, what this like rapid expansion of security institutions really resulted in was a lot of conflict between agencies and fragmentation within policing itself, right? Another really important transformation that I've already kind of alluded to a little bit was this outsourcing of security functions that happened in Venezuela. So over the course of the Bolivarian Revolution, somewhat under Chavez and much more so under Maduro, we've seen some state actors increasingly tolerate and encourage armed actors outside of formal institutions to perform functions that are traditionally associated with the police, right? In some cases, this outsourcing was intentional, so part of efforts to protect the revolution or maintain political control, and this includes, supporting groups that are now referred to as colectivos, as well as brokering agreements and arrangements with gangs in the country. But in other cases, the outsourcing was unintentional through increased circulation of weapons, institutional weakness, and informal alliances. But really, the net effect of all of this is really clear. The state relies on actors that it does not fully control to govern territory and violence, right? And then just really quickly, again, this like final transformation that I want to talk about is what I refer to as the dispersal of coercive power. And I refer to that as dispersal rather than decentralization, because decentralization really implies a clear transfer of authority from central to local institutions. And in Venezuela, what we really see is that coercion is instead redistributed across multiple actors simultaneously. And so this includes police forces, of which there are over 140 in the country, military, the colectivos that I've already referred to, and then gangs as well, right? And so these actors are often operating in overlapping and competing jurisdictions. So what does all this mean? I mean, it means that armed actors, both state and non-state, are often navigating highly unstable and competitive markets and contested territory. It means that legitimacy is also highly contested where it exists, and that collaboration between police forces is minimal due to mistrust between those forces, as well as interest that each police force has in maintaining control over resources and markets. And all of this has been made worse in recent years by authoritarian protection measures. They've really sought to minimize communication within police forces like the SEBIN, which is Venezuela's political police. And so, this really fragmented coercive landscape has major implications for any future political transition, right? And I mean, at least three problems emerge out of this. I mean, many more, but I'll just stick to three here. I mean, one, we have the problem of institutional fragmentation, right? And so, as I mentioned, there are now multiple police forces, military units, hybrid security institutions with overlapping jurisdictions and competing interests. They've received different types of training. They have different types of support from the government, and they will all very likely fiercely defend the survival of their institution, right? And so even when you think about getting rid of some of these forces, or at least like getting rid of many of their members, that presents a problem, right? Because we know that mass layoffs within police forces often creates a pipeline between state security forces and criminal organizations. So it presents this very pressing question of how do we keep those officers that are let go after a vetting process from feeding into non-state armed groups? And that's, of course, the second problem, armed non-state actors. Many of these non-state armed actors have become embedded in governance and territorial control. They will most likely resist attempts at disarmament and demobilization. They'll most likely negotiate political protections or oppose a transition if it infringes on their interests, right? Another problem here is that for the foreseeable future, it isn't clear how many resources or how much money the Venezuelan government will have to fill any power vacuums that are created by any disarmament or demobilization of these non-state armed groups. And then there's a question of like, do we even want state security forces filling that power vacuum if we haven't been able to systematically reform the state security apparatus, which is absolutely has to be done. And then finally, we have problematic police incentives, right? So, because we're talking about a highly unstable and competitive and conflictive security landscape, police officers operate alongside other armed actors, meaning that violence often functions as a really important strategy for them, right? It's a strategy for territorial control, for reputation, and for survival within a fragmented, coercive field. And these dynamics are not going to be resolved simply through institutional reform. So I'm going to just close with a final question that had been posed to me via email in terms of thinking about whether the conditions that gave rise to a lot of the systematic state violence that we've seen in Venezuela could persist or deepen in a post-Maduro scenario in Venezuela. So I think first thinking about the conditions that gave rise to this like incredibly lethal police violence that we've seen in the country in recent years, under Maduro, there are a couple of factors, right? There's extreme social and political instability, as well as an economic and a humanitarian crisis. And all this really pushes the government, and this is, according to the qualitative research that I've conducted, as well as Veronica as well, really pushes the government to rely on very spectacular displays of police violence, right, to attempt to maintain control in its territory. But I think it's really important to note here that systematic state violence against poor and working class sectors, which have really borne the brunt of police violence in recent years, has a very long history in Venezuela, and that predates Chavismo. This violence has long been justified and legitimized through the criminalization of young Black and Brown men's bodies. And so these are historical, structural, and institutional problems that were exacerbated by Chavista security policies, but did not arise with them, right? And I'm coming up on my 8 minutes. So I'll just say really quickly that another problem I think here is that the only policy I think that we know of Maduro's that was popular across different sectors, class sectors, right, were these very lethal police raids, these militarized police raids that were implemented by the government, right? Um, and we know from looking at other countries that like mano de obra policies, heavy-handed, violent, militarized strategies are very popular. So whatever government comes into power next, whether that be a Chavista government, an opposition government, or a mix of the two, they're going to be facing a landscape in which they really need to gain consent, legitimacy, and support very quickly. What is one of the easiest and quickest ways to do that is by utilizing this systematic state violence, unfortunately. And so we have, I think, persistent, longstanding motivations and incentives for any government to continue to utilize this type of systematic state violence, even if we maybe see a decrease in it potentially in the future.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. That was an amazing sort of summary within 8 minutes of a very complex scenario that you know better than many of us. So thank you for that. I think I can turn it over to my colleague Jennifer, who seems to be on the line, who might be able to take over for our moderation as well.
Okay, thank you all so much for bearing with us. We had to move to another room because of the microphone situation in the conference room. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for getting us started and painting this picture of the complexity of the security situation in Venezuela, which we know is very similar in other parts of Latin America as well, in terms of how state police are able to control territories in certain ways, but really do not control a lot of the rest of the country, and therefore a lot of various armed actors are fighting for territories in very complex ways. And I will, we were, are you able to go?
Yes, I can do it.
Okay, okay.
We had
Sorry, we were a little,
Yeah.
we had to move, but I will now turn it over to Veronica, who is ready to go ahead and present.
Okay,
Yeah.
so thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm so glad to be back to ILAS. So I will be try to be very fast because the question of communities' responses to violence is a long and complex field. But I would like to focus particularly in two aspects. One is the presence of guns and how guns and weapons have shaped everyday life. And the other question, the other aspect I would like to talk about is how communities, particularly women, respond to the proliferation of guns and the proliferation of armed actors. So my first point, so we can say that in the political process known as the Bolivarian Revolution, guns began to be present in everyday life, but in the politics as well. For instance, Chavez, after the coup d'etat in 2002, began to systematically repeat that the Bolivarian Revolution was a pacific, or yet armed revolution. Or even after Nicolas Maduro, where we turned into blatant authoritarian ways of governance, he once said that whatever he could, or the Bolivarian government could not reach with votes, it would achieve with guns. So within the Maduro government, we started to have lots of street unrest and massive protests. And you can understand that Maduro, in contrast to Chavez, with lack of charisma and lack of oil resources, he began to base his government more in coercive strategies. So we began to witness this proliferation of armed actors, as Becca was talking about, and guns in everyday life. So of course, Becca already talked about colectivos, these militarized raids where every year, especially after 2016, police forces were responsible of 4,000 deaths every year. But also more structured criminal organizations that governed everyday life in the communities. So within this landscape of armed actors and the proliferation of guns, guns began to impact everyday life in communities. For instance, doing research in popular sectors that in Caracas are called barrios. When people explain the history of the barrio, guns and murders perpetrated by guns were milestones in the history of the barrio. So people make the difference between before and after this killing. Stray bullets were also in everyday life, and murders and killings in barrios, but also guns were present, changing the geography of barrios. We started to have boundaries of animosities in the barrios, so people from one sector could not go across to the other sectors because gangs had these armed confrontations. So guns were present in these new boundaries and geographies of animosities. So, so guns, to sum up and to wrap up, guns are fundamental objects in everyday life in Venezuela, transforming everyday lives, everyday barrio histories, and biographies of people as well. So in this landscape of multiple armed actors, our ethnographic research, I work with Becca, wanted to focus on how communities reacted amidst this abandonment of state protection. On the contrary, amidst these very violent state militarized raids. So how women responded. And we focused on women because women are crucial actors and players in everyday life in the barrios, in these small scale societies. And they, and in a micro politics of the everyday barrios, they practice this management of conflicts. So we focus. So in this context of abandonment and the burden of the having to preserve the life of their beloved and families, we start to realize and to read a creativity of urgency. And drawing from Larissa Adler, the Lomnitz, we started to build concept of political survival strategies, how women dealt every day with armed actors in their neighborhoods. So what we appreciated and grasped is that women's strategies, and we work in a comparative ethnography, is that women strategies were dependent on local context and the type of presence of armed actors. So in a barrio or in context where there were histories and traditions of civic organizations, women gathered in peace commissions and could bargain with armed actors spaces of free of arms, free of weapons in order to have their kids. So and we were focused on discursive strategies perpetrated by developed by women. So we theorized about negotiating ceasefire pacts with gangs. We also so shouting, scolding, and using the mother figure. This was a cultural strategic tool, speaking to these guys, highlighting that they were mothers that gave them the moral and political authority to bargain and to scold them. So these were and gossip was also an important strategy because gossip plays with reputations and it has dramatic consequences. For instance, a young guy that has a bad reputation, he could be killed by the chief of the drug organization, or he could be denounced to the police. And on the contrary, in other communities where they had the military raids and the criminal organization was in a warfare state, women became subjugated, and women were deprived for these micro political capacities of bargaining with armed actors. So women were in a permanent state of fear. We wrote about gossip becoming captive because women were so afraid of being killed because there was an open and public burning of a woman that was accused of being whistleblower. So women became very afraid. So silence was one of the strategies that was nabbed. So I will end here saying that in the current configuration, in the current situation, one crucial aspect in the process of democratization that we hope might take place is this burden of women whose sons have been killed massively. So this gender aspect in the future policies of search for justice and reparations will be a fundamental aspect of redemocratization and the search for justice in Venezuela. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and especially for tying the presentation from your colleague that you're working with into a kind of more situated, everyday, and particular gendered perspective of how violence and prevention of violence gets negotiated within various communities. And I found very interesting, especially the idea of negotiation and the morality of kind of the motherly figure and the role that that actually plays, and the fact that you know we tend to talk about violence in large kind of scale terms, but a lot of it is played out and kind of managed at a micro level in communities. And thank you for that presentation, that kind of enlightening that topic here for us. And with that, we'll pass it along. Sorry, Eduardo, would you mind? Because I can't see anymore. It's saying who's next. I think it's Elizabeth.
I think so, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth Dickinson. I will pass this off to you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and it's great to learn from all of you as well. This is fascinating conversation, so it's really an honor to be a part of it. So I'm Deputy Director for Latin America here at International Crisis Group, based in Bogota. And if you don't know Crisis Group, essentially it's a field-based research organization. Our methodology is largely based on interviews and visits to the field. So I guess I will speak from that perspective, and also the perspective really of the primary work that I personally have done on this topic relates to border dynamics, and particularly two of the armed and criminal groups that figure into this strategy that was described so well by Rebecca about outsourcing of security by the regime to armed and criminal actors. So I'm going to particularly talk about two very important actors who are in rural areas, particularly in Venezuela. That is the National Liberation Army of Colombia, the ELN. And secondly, their sort of one-time ally, the Segunda Marquetalia, which is a faction of dissidents of the former FARC who retook arms in 2019 in Venezuela. So I guess I want to start because I think to understand the current context and remembering that we're just 2 months into this scenario, so it's very difficult to predict how these dynamics will continue to shift. I want to start with a paradox that we see sort of in the security situation at the moment, and particularly with regard to the security forces. And I'm going to do something quite unfair, which is I'm going to leave the paradox out there without answering it or explaining it, because I think it's a question that is really on our minds to try to understand. And that is, despite all of these complex relationships, the multiple security forces, the outsourcing of security, there have been no apparent fractures in the security system since January 3rd, which is actually fascinating because it could suggest that the incentives holding together that very ad hoc structure are stronger than we anticipated, or are fundamentally economic. And I will get to that point as I speak. So let me start with the sort of where we were before January 3rd, which I think will help us understand sort of where we are today. And I want to focus particularly on the ELN. The ELN is an insurgency, a leftist insurgency that was founded in the 1960s here in Colombia, but particularly over the last decade has really taken on a binational identity, meaning that in Colombia, they are fighting against the Colombian state, but in Venezuela, where they have as many as half of their troops now present, they have acted essentially in alignment with the Chavista regime up until now. And they have enjoyed sort of not only safe haven, but also this sort of co-governance relationship that existed between particularly local authorities in Venezuela and the areas where the ELN was present. The ELN, despite being sort of a guerrilla movement here in Colombia, which is the way that we usually think about it, an insurgency, essentially was playing a paramilitary style role within Venezuela, and that has changed, and I think has transformed the organization, for one thing, because of the extent of ELN combatants that are now in Venezuela, that are Venezuelan, that were recruited in Venezuela. A key part of the organization now responds to the Venezuelan context rather than the Colombian political situation. Coming into the January 3rd offensive, the ELN was emboldened. After 3 years of on and off negotiations with the government in Colombia, we saw that essentially the organization used those talks to fortify its presence, particularly on the Venezuelan side of the border. Those talks finally fell apart about a year before the US intervention with a rapid fire offensive by the ELN to control the Venezuela-Colombia border. And this empowered position in which the ELN has key assets on both sides of the border is the situation that they found themselves in when January 3rd happened. So let's talk about their presence inside Venezuela. I think a key factor here, first to understand, is the role that the ELN has played in recent years in its relationship with the government in Caracas in securing the border. Caracas, in its sort of military imagination, had always thought that threats from the US would materialize via the Colombian border. So that the Americans would enter through the Colombian border, they would use Colombian proxies, etc. And the ELN in that dynamic was essentially given a green light from authorities in Caracas to consolidate their control along that entire perimeter and ensure that this backdoor was closed in the context of the new US Trump administration. That corridor, I think the ELN didn't need to be asked twice to take it. Extremely lucrative trafficking corridor. Of course, thinking about sort of the movement of cocaine from Colombia into particularly the northern part of Venezuela for traffic through the Atlantic coast. But the depth of trafficking across this border goes well beyond the illicit economy. In Arauca, very profitable trafficking of cattle. In the southern provinces, very lucrative trafficking of mining. Trafficking of basic goods and moments of shortages within Venezuela. That would be petrol, or it would be medicines, or it would be toilet paper. Whatever was missing on one side of the border was trafficked, I think, with the complicity and providing profits essentially to the ELN. The other key economic role that the ELN plays within Venezuela really is in the mining sector. The ELN, interestingly, within Colombia, but also in Venezuela, engages in drug trafficking, but their real focus is mining. And they have understood that this is a market and an illicit economy that is much more profitable, long-term, and easy to launder. Because moving gold in and out of the legal supply chain particularly has proven quite easy. And quite possible, particularly in the sort of lawless nature of some of the areas in Venezuela where the gold is extracted. So the ELN has established a very significant presence in a number of mines, not just of gold, but also here we're talking about the rare earth minerals that we now hear Washington interested in. And that operation has essentially worked through a series of coercive arrangements. The first is a coercive arrangement with the local community. Including engaging in human rights violations, for example, forced labor, including of children, complete control of communities in terms of their discipline and their compliance with the economic sort of role of the ELN in these areas, and the other sort of very important relationship here, which goes back to the paradox I mentioned at the beginning, is the complicity of the security forces. And here it's very important to understand that the profits that are moving through the ELN, both from mining but also trafficking, are also profits for the Venezuelan security forces. And in fact, this illicit revenue stream that flows between illegal and legal actors is in many ways the glue that is holding this system together. To the extent that, for example, members of the security forces will pay their senior commanders to be positioned in mining areas, understanding that these posts are the most lucrative. This is where you earn the money. This is where you get the payoff from, the movement of these materials. January 3rd comes. The ELN, who had promised to defend the government in Caracas, was remarkably silent. There was no resistance. There was no sort of visible action by the ELN. But in fact, this goes back to exactly the role that the ELN was given by Caracas, which is to defend the border. And they have done exactly that. In the weeks since this operation, they have essentially dug into the border. And I think this is now a strategic interest of theirs that they will seek to carve out as essentially an autonomous area where they are the de facto authorities, whether or not the Venezuelans continue to collaborate. At a broader level, I think the ELN, like all of us, is asking questions about what does this mean? How much has changed and how much hasn't changed? The ELN has key strategic relationships with officials in the government in Caracas. Their most important relationships, though, were at a local level. And so primarily, I think the focus at the moment is really keeping that revenue flowing and ensuring that their allies continue to benefit from their own illicit economic activity so that the relationship remains more or less stable. The primary concern on the part of the ELN has to do with high-level captures by the Venezuelan government, or it's sort of the delivery of ELN individuals to the United States, potentially as bargaining ships. So we have seen sort of a movement back to clandestinity from the ELN, taking a less visible role in some of these communities, thinking that they could be sort of an open target. At the moment, what does this mean sort of for the reconfiguration of where these groups will be going forward? The ELN has taken a decision that there are 3 areas that are strategic for them in Venezuela that they will fight very hard against forfeiting. The first is, as I said, the border, this extremely lucrative corridor that allows them not only safe haven from Colombian security forces, but also this consistent economic stream. Secondly, the mining areas, which interestingly, as in Venezuela, in Colombia, if you look at the areas of active ELN combat against rival organizations, they all align with mining areas. This is their priority in terms of economic control. And I think a final area to mention is that the ELN is interested in securing a new refuge in the Amazon region of southern Venezuela, which they have not had before, but this would be sort of a strategic zone where they could, go take a step back for a minute if they are under pressure from security forces. I want to finish by just talking a little bit about how this might change the criminal organizations themselves within the context of now a US aligned government in Caracas. And I think the bottom line here is that it is likely to radicalize them in terms of their ideological and their tactical positions in the country. The ELN has, for the first time, really been vocally called by senior officials in the White House as an enemy. And this is the greatest political gift that they have gotten in years. To be seen as the enemy of the United States, not just by themselves, but by the United States. And that is an ideological drive that they will capitalize on to recruit, but possibly also to make tactical alliances with other insurgent, particularly organizations in Venezuela and Colombia, in order to secure their interests. I also think that the one of the interesting repercussions of this situation is that it will likely complicate further efforts to negotiate a peace agreement with the ELN in Colombia, which have been ongoing now for nearly a dozen governments have tried. The reason, of course, is first of all, they are on a tactical back foot, trying to secure their interests, unsure where Caracas sits. But secondly, because their focus is increasingly economic and on taking advantage, let's say, of that anti-imperial moment that is so important to their ideological rhetoric that they rely upon to justify themselves. And I think that this really bodes in terms of instability, not just in Venezuela, and just to drive home the point that I think all of these dynamics in Venezuela will continue to have repercussions, not just in Colombia, but also in Brazil and the 3 border area that includes as well Peru. So we are at the beginning, I think, of this very long story.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for providing such a succinct and detailed account. It is, in particular, quite interesting, this paradox that you set up, which, of course, I think we can't answer right now, but as to why there are no apparent fractures in the security systems, at least to this point. But of course, we are well over 2 months since the US intervention. So it is something very much to pay attention to. And I think the point about, the ways in which what is often, what you're referring to and is often being called environmental organized crime now, in terms of how armed actors, including the ELN, are trafficking, not just, narco trafficking, but actively, mining, trafficking cattle, trafficking other goods, which has extreme impact on environments. And of course, then displacement of communities that are living in the areas that are being impacted by this. So connecting that to the political projects of armed actors, and clearly in the ELN is a particularly demonstrative case of this. And in particular, the binational aspect of the ELN, where one of the projects is to overthrow the Colombian state, and the other is actually what seems like a border patrol project that serves Venezuela and is actually also part of the ideological project insofar as it is an anti-imperial position. So thank you very much for that. And I think let's move on to our last speaker today, Tiziano Breda. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to the Institute of Latin American Studies for the invitation. It's a real honor to be part of this conversation with illustrious colleagues whose work I really appreciate and who have already laid out quite well what are the current sort of challenges that Venezuela is facing in terms of security. I was asked to sort of chip in and comment a bit about what ACLED data. ACLED basically collects data on political violence and organized crime violence in Latin America and the Caribbean and protests. And we've been collecting data since 2018 in this region, and we update the database almost in real time on a weekly basis. And so I was asked to sort of chip in and comment about what the trends in Venezuela tell us about the patterns of violence in the country and how does this relate to other contexts in the region. So I would say a couple of things. First of all, we've noticed a steady decline in the levels of overall violence in the country since 2019, when back then Venezuela was recorded the third highest levels of violence in the whole region in absolute terms, and it was even higher than Colombia actually. To last year, where we were able to record events that were lower than in any other country in which we collect basically organized crime violence in the region. And we recorded even fewer events than very much smaller countries, such as Guatemala and Honduras, which is quite startling. So this decline in violence has sort of contributed to Venezuela going down in the rankings of what we have, what we call a conflict index, which is a tool that we use to rank the sort of 50 most severe conflicts around the world by looking at their deadliness, the harm, the danger for civilians, so the sort of the amount of the share of violence targeting civilians, the geographic diffusion and the fragmentation of the conflict actors. And Venezuela went down from ranking 14th in 2021 to 34th last year. And the only dimension that kept Venezuela really in this quite high in this ranking in any case was the fragmentation landscape. Because indeed, this is the country in which we've been able to identify the presence and the actions of, I would say, the highest amount and the widest array of organized crime and rebel groups. And I will just show a map to visualize it, if you allow me, because it was really impressive. The sort of geographic dispersion, but also the amount of actors that we collected, which is over 850 different groups from gangs, trenes, sindicatos, Colombian rebel groups, and so on, colectivos, and so on and so forth, since 2018. Which, if you just look at it, Mexico, which is the second country by number of armed groups that we were able to record, we've been able to track down less than half the amount of these groups in the same period of time. But at the same time, with the decline in violence, we also recorded a decline in the number of active groups that we could sort of identify on a yearly basis. Last year, we tracked down actions by some 73 active groups in a way or another. which for the first time was lower than what we could record for Mexico, which was over 100, and to levels already similar to Colombia and Brazil, for example, countries in which in turn we have seen a gradual increase in the fragmentation of actors, and so the number of actors that has been increasing. So I think Beth, Rebecca, Veronica have already talked about some of the dimension of violence. One of the reasons why um, we believe that there's been this decrease in violence has been a U-turn, no, in the approach from the Maduro administration towards armed groups, particularly urban gangs, during his mandates, because it turned from even cooperation or dealings, now some non-aggression deal in exchange for social control, to a more confrontational approach, at least towards those gangs who had lost some political backing, who had sort of become a public image problem, such as the Tren de Aragua, or had defied the state, such as the Tren de Llano, and so on and so forth. And we actually see a consistently high levels of confrontation, of clashes between different agencies of security forces and gangs throughout the years. And interestingly, confirming what has been said, the share of the clashes between security forces and gangs in the overall events of violence is the highest in the region. Almost one in every two events that we record of violence related to organized crime in the country since 2018 has to deal with clashes between security forces and gangs or criminal structures in general. And actually, if we add to this the direct participation of security forces in act of violence against civilians, this share goes up to 60%. So it's really the state in which the state involvement, the security forces involvement in the production of violence is certainly one of the most significant factor in the overall violence sort of levels. But also there's been a collapse, no, of the Venezuelan economy that has contributed to making extortion, kidnapping for ransom that are crucial revenues for particularly smaller, more urban gangs. It has made them less rentable, right, over time. And this has prompted hundreds, if not thousands, of including gang members, to join the exodus of the 8 million Venezuelans that have left the country over the past decade. An additional element, which Elizabeth alluded to, is the fact that there's been this sort of ELN takeover of certain mining sites and drug trafficking corridors, often sponsored by the state, if not subcontracted by the state, which led to the imposition of an armed order, no? An hegemonic control over certain parts of the country, displacing other criminal actors. Let's think of the clashes with the 10th Front of the FARC dissidents in 2021 in Apure, or other gangs in Bolivar and Amazonas states, for example. And when an hegemonic control is established, often violence levels tend to go down. So a reduction in violence doesn't necessarily mean an improvement in the security situation. And finally, we have to be honest. There's certainly been a restriction in the levels of information that has been coming out of Venezuela over the past few years. On one hand, growing sort of pressure and crackdown on dissent by the Maduro government. On the other, the imposition of armed groups control of course caused censorship or self-censorship in many parts of the country, particularly the more rural areas. And on the other hand, the economic collapse, and in addition to that, the funding cuts that have come from some donors, particularly the US, over the past year or so, have contributed to many media outlets to shut down, and observatories as well. So reducing the amount of information that comes and that we can integrate in the database. I'll just wrap up by saying It's early, probably, as Elizabeth was saying, to sort of assess trends after the 3rd of January, but there are a couple of dimensions that I think is worth keeping an eye on. First of all, at the urban level, if the economic collapse contributed to a reduction of violence, because some gangs we heard from the ground sort of became more lenient in a way towards extortion payments that could not be made physically because of the situation. What would an economic stabilization or even recovery and the subsequent return of Venezuela mean for the incentives to carry out to carry out illicit activities and carry out violence associated with it? And on the other hand, when it comes to the ELN, I suspect, and I would be surprised otherwise, that the ELN has been part of the conversation with the CIA director coming to Venezuela, the Trump administration, overall the discussions with Des Rodriguez. And I would be surprised if he wasn't part of the conversation tomorrow in the meeting between Petro and Des Rodriguez. We've already seen a change. Last year, there was a massive increase in operations, particularly since August, of security forces dismantling armed groups' camps, seizing drugs, seizing sort of gasoline or weapons, destroying drug laboratories, and even clashing 3 times at least that could cause with the ELN, causing 12 deaths, which is the highest. It's not massive, but it's the highest amount of death in the clashes between security forces and the ELN since 2018. So would a more confrontational approach change even the relationship within the ELN and the state? I think it's an open question. And would the changing relationship, if there was some, between the ELN and security forces be exploited by other gangs that are still operating in certain mining areas to try and sort of challenge the ELN's control, and we could see then also an increase in clashes between groups. I think these are open questions that I'll leave it there, but I look forward to the discussion and thank again for the opportunity to join the panel.
Thank you so much, Tiziano, for that and for drawing attention to the shifts in both amount of violence, the quantity of violence, and in how it's playing out in terms of against civilians and which is to say unarmed actors and kind of between security forces and organized criminal groups, because we often think of them so much either in collaboration or fighting one another. And I think there's often a large mix of the two. I will ask Eduardo if we have any time for questions. We have a few, and I could pick one from the chat, or if we need to close up.
Yeah, no, I think if our panelists have 5, 6 more minutes to give us of their time, they've already been very generous. There have been quite a few questions in the Q&A. I mean, perhaps Jennifer, if you want to try and combine a few and pose them to the group, we could end with that.
Sure. I guess I'll draw attention to one question about the potential danger of the U.S. government's lack of interest in security sector reform and perhaps institutional reform more broadly. And in particular, I guess I would ask how this relates to the increase in mining and kind of U.S. interest in resources. So, of course, we're also kind of looking at this from an eye perspective of violence. So we can take that from there. Hopefully that's clear enough. I'm summing up a lot, and I will open it up to any of our panelists.
Yeah, I can go ahead and jump in. So, I mean, I think first I would want to note that I think it's important to say the US has not had a particularly successful role at engaging in security reforms in other countries. So I think that's just an important background to keep in mind as we kind of think about what the US's role should be in Venezuela. But yeah, I think it's a problematic lack of discussion, right? But not one that's not unsurprising. I mean, it seems very clear that Trump's interest in Venezuela is stability. What he's looking for is stability. State security reform generates a huge amount of instability, both within state security forces and within criminal markets, right? I mean, this is what we saw precisely when the Venezuelan government implemented a 2008 police reform. It caused so much conflict and fragmentation within state security forces, right? And so I think this is a conscious decision to kind of stay away from that topic for right now because he knows that, I mean, particularly for the reasons that Elizabeth was talking about, right? The reason why we haven't seen, and we should have probably already seen way more conflict, even though we do see conflict between police and gangs, but way more conflict on the ground than we've seen. And it's because economic interests have not been altered very much, right? As soon as the United States tries to go in with any kind of major security reforms, whether or not we think it's going to be a good thing, that is going to cause an extreme amount of instability that will then cause market disruption, conflict between state security forces, more violence, and more conflict, right? And so I think that there was a fourth question that got to that, right? I mean, so yeah, I think it's not surprising that we haven't seen this. I'm not sure that the US's role in any kind of state security reform is going to be a positive one. If we look at the Trump administration's policies regarding policing in the United States, if we assume that those are going to be similar policies implemented in Venezuela, that's only going to make conflict worse. And then the last thing that I'll just mention on this is that, I think over the long term, for state security reform to be successful, there's going to have to be a very effective and successful transitional justice process that happens in Venezuela, right? And that's not something that can be imposed from the outside. It can be supported by by other state countries, right? But it's going to have to be something that's largely internally driven. And so I think, yes, it's problematic for it's not surprising for the reasons that I mentioned. And also, I think we really have to think very carefully about what kind of role we want the United States to have in, reforming the state security apparatus in Venezuela.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Veronica would like to weigh in, and then Elizabeth, we
Yes.
can close us up. Yeah.
So yes, concerning that question, I would say that the situation is very volatile in the sense that, and we wrote about that, Becca, that the current coalition of power between the military sector of Diosdado Cabello and the civil sector of the Rodriguez brothers, we can read a tension within this sector. So anything that has to do with security reforms has to deal with the colectivos that are still an important actor there. So we would have to go into complex processes of disarmament, demobilization, and gun control. And we don't see at all the US interested in all those processes. So we might start, just to finish, we might start to witness focuses of political violence. For instance, if this coalition breaks between the military branch and the civilian branch. So the situation is very volatile, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Elizabeth.
Yeah, so I like this question because I think it really drives home really the importance of addressing the fundamental question at the crux of the political system in Venezuela, which is this conflict between Chavismo and all of the other sectors of civil society and civic space and political life. And I think because there has not been that conversation, because there is no agreement about sort of how this would look, there would have to be conversations before you started about, what kind of guarantees legally could you offer? What sort of amnesties and what sort of not amnesties would you offer? What would it look like? What are the conditions for sort of leaving the security forces? Who is eligible? Who stays? And that is a conversation that has to happen domestically within the Venezuelan political context. And I think it is a fundamental first step. Maybe let me just ground it in the situation of critical minerals, which was mentioned. Let's imagine for a moment that you removed the corrupt officials from these mining areas, or that you tried to dislodge the criminal groups there. Eliminating this flow of illicit income could essentially be taking that glue out of the system that's holding it together. The security forces are keeping together because they continue to benefit from being part of the system, and they have an incentive to continue to fulfill their roles, whatever that might look like. Without those illicit rents and without that enrichment and complicity with these illicit economies, that incentive disappears, and you could really see a disintegration of that unity very quickly. So this is a dilemma I think that the US private sector will also face when it comes to mining, because as the sector exists today, almost every mine that is successfully producing gold will violate human rights or environmental conditions or territorial guarantees for indigenous communities. And those are conditions that would have to fundamentally change if we're talking about responsible supply chains. And the big question here is whether the US is interested in that conversation or will look the other way.
Thank you very much. That was a particularly succinct way to wrap this conversation up. Yeah, Eduardo, would you like to sign us off?
No, I think Tiziano just has one wants to chime in as well. Yeah.
I just have one like question to throw out on this and to give it more thought in a future opportunity. But would, even with the successful reform of some kind, would the Venezuelan state have the capacity actually to enforce then security, particularly in rural areas? And if the relationship would change with Colombian armed groups, particularly the ELN, maybe we could see even the eruption of the different kinds of violence, because the ELN, of course, has developed tactics in Colombia, no, of guerrilla warfare. It has, together with the FARC, developed the use of drones, which has not done in Venezuela so far, but it could, impose that were the situation to change. So I think it's also worth asking, what the evolution of the challenges that a possible, very far, very distant sort of reform to the security apparatus could also open, no, in how this should be addressed if that were to happen. I just wanted to wrap up here. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tiziano, for adding to that. I think we'll close out here. And Eduardo, I don't know if you want to add, or if we can just, thank everyone on behalf of the Institute for Latin American Studies here in Colombia for being here. And thank you especially to our panelists for coming together and sharing your knowledge and being in conversation with one another, with all of us. So thank you very much.
So I'll just echo that as well on behalf of the ILAS. This was incredibly informative, and I think the questions that got raised at the end point to the fact that we're going to have many more of these types of conversations moving forward as well. And thanks so much to Jennifer as well for moderating today's discussion too. Thank you again, and take care.